There was a time when trains weren't just machines, they were lifelines. They stitched Canada together through forests, mountains, storms, and silence. These engines carried families, carried hopes, carried entire towns into the future, and then, one by one, they vanished. Today, the tracks are quiet. Stations that once echoed with footsteps now stand empty. Rusted locomotives sit in the rain, their stories fading, their whistles heard only in memory. But once, they were giants, from the legendary TurboTrain to the Newfie Bullet that crossed an island of fog and forests, to the streetcars that shaped our cities. These were the trains that built a nation. In this episode of Classical Canada, we're bringing them back. The forgotten engines, the abandoned rail lines, the trains that carried our parents and grandparents across the country. So sit back, because we're about to travel through time on the tracks that once carried Canada. CN TurboTrain. It looked like something from the future, sleek, silver, and impossibly fast. The CN TurboTrain was Canada's bold attempt to bring high-speed rail to North America. It could hit nearly 200 kilometers an hour, and when it roared down the tracks between Toronto and Montreal, people swore they could feel the ground shake. But the TurboTrain was ahead of its time, maybe too far ahead. Mechanical issues, harsh winters, and complex systems made it difficult to keep running. Slowly, the dream faded. Today, only a few pieces survive, quiet reminders of the moment when Canada tried to outrun the future. The Newfie Bullet. It was slow, painfully slow, but to Newfoundlanders, the Newfie Bullet was never about speed. It was about belonging. This narrow-gauge train crossed rugged terrain, rocky coastlines, and endless stretches of wilderness, connecting small towns that would have otherwise been isolated. For 90 years, it carried families, soldiers, groceries, even the mail. But when roads came, the bullet slowed and finally stopped. Its tracks were torn up, and only pieces of the route remain. Yet for the people who remember it, the Newfie Bullet will always be a symbol of home. BC Electric Interurban. Before highways, before traffic jams, Vancouver and the Fraser Valley were connected by a fleet of elegant electric interurban trains. They glided through farmland, forests, and small towns, quietly carrying workers, school children, and families going into the city. But by the 1950s, cars took over. The tracks were pulled up, the wires removed, and the interurbans disappeared. A few survive in museums, still polished and proud, the last electric whisper of a gentler era. CP's The Dominion. It was once the flagship of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Dominion, a transcontinental journey across mountains, prairies, and rivers. Elegant dining cars, polished sleepers, and the deep rumble of a locomotive cutting through the heart of the country. But when the Canadian arrived, brighter, modern, and faster, the Dominion slowly faded away. The last run came quietly in 1966, and a piece of railway royalty disappeared from the tracks forever. CNU-1F Bullet Nose Betty steam locomotives. She wasn't just a locomotive, she was a movie star on rails. The U-1F steam engines, nicknamed Bullet Nose Betty, were powerful, graceful, and instantly recognizable for their bullet-shaped smokebox doors. They pulled passenger trains across the country during the final years of the steam era. But when diesel arrived, Betty's elegant whistle went silent. Only one survives today, a relic of the days when steam ruled the rails. The Atlantic, For generations, the Atlantic linked Montreal with the Maritimes, a lifeline stretching across Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. For students returning home, soldiers on leave, and families visiting loved ones, this train meant connection. But as air travel and highways expanded, the Atlantic saw fewer passengers. By 1981, its final whistle echoed through quiet station platforms, and a century of memories rolled away into history. CN Railiners Bud RDC fleet. They were small, silver, and surprisingly fast. Self-propelled Bud Rail diesel cars, known simply as RDCS. They served rural towns where big trains didn't stop, helping isolated communities stay connected. Over time, the routes grew quieter. Population shifted, roads improved, and the little railiners were retired one by one. A few still survive in tourist service, but their glory days are long gone. Ontario Northland Northlander. From Toronto to Cochrane, the Northlander cut through forests, lakes, and northern skies. It wasn't glamorous, but for thousands of northern families, it was essential. In 2012, the service was discontinued, leaving many communities without rail access. Old stations fell silent, and the Northlander faded into memory. A revival has been promised, but the original train is gone forever. The Pacific Great Eastern Caribou Prospector. A true northern legend, the Caribou Prospector traveled from North Vancouver deep into British Columbia's rugged interior. Miners, loggers, families, and adventurers all rode this lonely rail line. But as industry changed and highways took over, the line became too expensive to maintain. When the final train pulled into the station in 2002, an entire chapter of Northern Canadian history came to a close. VIA Rails, the Supercontinental. Long before VIA Rail existed, the Supercontinental was already a legend. A transcontinental Canadian national train that traveled from Montreal to Vancouver. Domed observation cars, elegant dining, mountains, prairies, and endless sky. This was the golden age of passenger rail. But when budgets tightened in 1990, the Supercontinental made its final run. Today, it lives on only in photographs and the memories of those lucky enough to ride it. CP Rails, the Atlantic Limited. For more than 80 years, the Atlantic Limited connected Montreal with St. John, New Brunswick. It carried students returning home for holidays, new immigrants searching for opportunity, and families visiting the maritime coast. But changing travel habits and shrinking budgets slowly pushed the train toward the edge. In 1994, the service made its final journey, leaving behind empty tracks and a lifetime of maritime memories. The Prairie Dog Central Branch Lines. In the prairies, rail wasn't just transportation, it was survival. Dozens of small rural branch lines carried grain, supplies, and families from town to town. These lines stitched together the heartland of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But as elevators closed and freight moved to highways, most branch lines went silent. The Prairie Dog Central survives only as a tourist train, while the original network fades into the wheat fields. BC Rail's Royal Hudson Steam Service. It was one of Canada's most iconic tourist trains. The Royal Hudson, a gleaming steam locomotive that carried passengers from North Vancouver to Squamish. With its polished metal, deep whistle, and billowing smoke, the Royal Hudson felt like stepping back in time. But rising maintenance costs ended the run in 2000. The mountains remain, but the roar of the Royal Hudson is gone. The Calgary-Edmonton Dayliner. For decades, Albertans rode the Dayliner between Calgary and Edmonton, a fast, convenient connection between the province's biggest cities. But as cars became more affordable and highways improved, ridership collapsed. When the service was discontinued in 1985, it marked the end of true intercity passenger rail in Alberta. The Gaspé train, Le Chaleur. Running along the edge of cliffs and ocean, the Gaspé train, later known as Le Chaleur, offered one of the most breathtaking routes in Canada. But erosion, storm damage, and decades of underfunding slowly crippled the line. By 2013, the last passenger train left Gaspé, and the tracks grew silent. Supercontinental. The Supercontinental was once CN's flagship passenger train, a transcontinental journey from Montreal to Vancouver, carrying soldiers, workers, families, and tourists across the endless forests and prairies of Canada. But as air travel took over and costs climbed, the legendary train slowly lost steam. When it was discontinued in 1981, an entire era of cross-country rail travel disappeared with it. The Winnipeg-Churchill mixed train. In the remote north, the mixed train to Churchill was more than transportation. It was a lifeline. Passengers sat beside grain sacks, crates, and supplies headed to isolated communities along the Hudson Bay Railway. But roads improved, freight moved to separate services, and the mixed train faded away. For many northern residents, its final run felt like losing a trusted old friend. VIA Rail's the Canadian original route. Before the 1990 realignment, the Canadian ran on the spectacular CP Rail route through Banff, Lake Louise, and the dramatic mountain passes. When the route was shifted to CN's Northern Line to save money, the original journey, one of the most beautiful in the world, was lost forever. The train still runs today, but the classic CP mountain route exists only in memory. CN's turbos. They were futuristic, fast, and unlike anything Canada had ever seen. The TurboTrains, racing between Toronto and Montreal at speeds no North American passenger train had reached before. But the turbos were fragile, expensive to maintain, and didn't handle Canadian winters well. By 1982, the experiment was over, leaving behind grainy footage, rusting parts, and a glimpse of a future that never fully arrived. The Ontario Northland Northlander. The Northlander connected Toronto to Cochrane, passing lakes, forests, and quiet northern towns. It wasn't glamorous, but it was loved, especially by communities with few other transportation options. When it shut down in 2012, some towns lost their only dependable link to the south. To this day, many hope it will return, but the original Northlander is gone. These trains weren't just machines, they were memories. The sound of steel wheels, the smell of diesel, the excitement of going somewhere new. And today, many of them sit silent, retired, rusting, or remembered only in old photographs and family stories. But by talking about them, by keeping their names alive, we keep a small part of Canada's history alive, too. If you grew up riding any of these trains, or if one of them holds a special memory for you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through Canada's forgotten rails, please consider subscribing to Classical Canada. Even one subscription means a lot to me and helps keep these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep the past rolling.